Schizoid personalities seem to be a very misunderstood continuum. You can have someone who's structurally catatonic to the creative genius. One of the big problems with this category is that the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual breaks it down into several different categories, some psychotic, some non-psychotic, and they're a bit mixed up together. The word and variations on the word are fairly common in my field and in our culture, and they mean the meanings of the individual variations are really quite confusing and confused. Schizoid, schizotypal, avoidant personality, schizophrenia, schizophreniform disorder, schizoaffective disorder, all of these are variations on fundamentally the same theme, but there's so many different categories that I think everyone's quite confused about it. So what McWilliams does is, I think, narrow it down to its fundamental. Yes, there can be a continuum from catatonic to really the isolated creative genius, but the core defense, the key defense, is withdrawal. These people at an unconscious emotional level have taken their ball and gone home. They only could go actually in one direction, and that was within. The details of the childhood development we'll talk about in a minute. But this is made doubly complicated by the fact that there are in our culture folks who seem to be quite schizoid as a function of their defense against anxiety, and yet are quite effective and quite adaptive and quite successful. Philosophers, people with sort of severe discipline, spiritual quests, theoretical physicists and scientists, creative artists sometimes. I think the most obvious and common example are folks who spend their lives in computers. People who are in front of a screen all the time and have a limited amount of actual human contact are almost by definition schizoid in their dynamics. And yet they can be quite successful, quite powerful even. So there's often confusion in my field, and I think quite common confusion in the world, in our culture, when someone who is of marked schizoid tendencies seems to be quite successful. I've had a couple of major surgeries. I had total hip replacement on both sides 10, 12 years ago. And what I found is my surgeon was quite schizoid. He was very withdrawn, very distant. He operated on people as if he was a mechanic working on a car engine. There was almost no emotional connection there at all. And I didn't really want any emotional connection. I wanted him to be like a stone-cold professional mechanic. I didn't want a kind of thoughtfulness about my feelings. I just wanted him to do the surgery right. And so I can imagine, not just in some of the areas I've discussed, but in some others, police officers, sometimes soldiers. You want them a little bit withdrawn emotionally. You want them to be, in some ways, stone-cold professionals. A schizoid person might come across that way, might actually, in their particular field, have a professional benefit from being slightly emotionally detached. Criminal defense attorneys, I think, very frequently have schizoid dynamics because they go into a field where it is structurally inappropriate for them to have any kind of emotional connection to their patients, to their clients. And when they do, it's often quite a problem for them and perhaps the client as well. So they get into a field, surgery, police work sometimes, criminal defense, therapy. It seems like there's a tendency for some therapists to have some basic schizoid dynamics. They deal with other people's issues at a bit of a distance. It can work for them to some degree. So that's the problem with schizoid dynamics. It isn't just something that's maladaptive. Given the sort of odd technological development in our culture, we find it can actually be financially rewarding to have a schizoid dynamic when you can turn it into some kind of creative employment or when in your particular profession a detached emotional response can be quite effective, adaptive, useful, and can be seen as sort of professional. The question again isn't what they do, it's the meaning of the thing, not the thing, the meaning of the thing. If there is an unconscious withdrawal defense generating the behavior, it might be seen as professional, it might be effective in a culture. It's a problem for the person's development if that is the motivating dynamic. Drive, affect, and temperament. It doesn't appear that there's very much biological in this dynamic at all. They may, I mean, again, there's no evidence of this in any scientific research. One has the sense that their nerves are a little closer to the surface. They feel things perhaps more delicately than others. They don't appear to have much empathy for others. They've withdrawn. They don't feel much guilt. They don't feel much shame. They don't feel much of anything. It appears that the defense of withdrawal in the schizoid dynamic seems to be rather global. Now, that doesn't mean they haven't felt, and it doesn't mean they can't feel now. It's just defended against. They tend to present themselves as the outsider, the observer, the onlooker. They can stand apart and make intellectual comments about the human condition. It isn't that they don't have connections to others. This isn't the kind of person who goes off into the woods by themselves. Maybe it is, but that's not the norm. The norm is one who, though there may be people around him, he or she keeps an intellectual, emotional distance from them all. They do have they can come across as a bit arrogant, or at the very least detached. It's different than narcissism. There isn't that grandiosity about them. There is a sense of detachedness, of distance. You get that from a narcissist as well, but this feeling is very different. It's one of the diagnostic indicators in a therapist. If I see someone and they're withdrawn, are they narcissistic or are they schizoid or something else? Most of the countertransference to a schizoid is neutral or even favorable. They tend to be likable people in some ways. They're not dangerous, they're not annoying, and you tend to want to wrap around them a little bit and sort of help them. That actually can be a problem. Therapeutic implications of the diagnosis of schizoid personality. They are deep, and as a therapist, they can pull you in. But I've used the example before that, to me, a schizoid person is like a scared kitten in some ways. A scared kitten hiding underneath the bed. They've had a relational dynamic in childhood where they've been impinged on, controlling, impinging parents, no rest, never letting them up. And so you end up just sort of being overwhelmed and pulling back. That's the defense in childhood that generates the necessary safety for the child's mind. It's not healthy, it's not good, it doesn't work in terms of fostering a full adaptive growth. But you see impinging, over-invested, over-involved parents generating this kind of thing all the time. And I think that idea of the sort of scared kitten is a really useful analogy. If a scared kitten runs underneath the bed, what do? You don't bring in the dog, you don't lift the bed up, you don't get a broomstick. All of those things are way, way too aggressive. How do you get a scared kitten out from the bed? You wait. You prove yourself safe. You prove yourself trustworthy. You put a little bowl of something nice down next to you and you sit and quietly wait. That's actually the best way. If you reach in and try to grab the little kitten, you're going to get bit and scratched and scare the kitten even more. I think actually a schizoid person feels that way to the therapist. You have to be patient. You have to wait. You have to be trustworthy. You can't go in and get them, even though your tendency is to want to help them. You get that they're withdrawn because they've been hurt and they don't want human contact because they're afraid of being sort of engulfed by it the way they were in their childhoods. So you want to help them, so you reach in. The tendency for therapists is to be a little aggressive with schizoid type patients if you're not really clear what's going on. You can't go get them. You've got to wait and let them come out to you. You've got to be safe. You've got to be trustworthy. and you got to be consistent for a schizoid person to respond favorably in therapy. Back to the childhood development, the etiology or the cause of this. McWilliams points out a pretty consistent pattern. We have a seductive or boundary transgressing a mother and an impatient critical father. Contradictory and confusing communications, double binding, emotionally dishonest messages. You put a child in that kind of household environment, and they frequently, especially I think the impinging, the over-invested, over-involved parent, drives the child to withdraw. Now, here's what makes this a serious dynamic is that as human beings, we have to have relationships to survive. A child will not survive without the nurturing care of its parents. So that in order for the schizoid dynamic to be created, really the nurturing environment, or what's supposed to be a nurturing environment in the house, has to be almost the opposite. To drive a child away from emotional care, to drive a child to abandon that emotional connection because of that impingement, to withdraw from that necessary loving connection, it runs counter to everything developmentally that we need to really be fully human. So they fear impingement, they fear engulfment more than they do abandonment, which is very unusual. They must have had tremendous pain as children to pull away from the very thing that defines the best of human development. So, and yet they cannot completely pull back. They are, as we all are, fundamentally human, and we need love and care. So what you find with schizoid is what Harry Guntrip, a great analyst from the 50s and 60s, said. He called it the in and out program, is that they lean in, they pull back. They put their toe in the water, they pull back. I know a criminal defense attorney, and he's been married a couple of times, and he gets in relationships, and he gets close, then he pulls back, and then he gets close, and then he pulls back. He gets in that kind of relationship with me even sometimes. And you find that the schizoid type very frequently gets into relationships with the hysterical type, the over-emotional type. Why is that? The narcissist will hook up with a masochist. A schizoid will often hook up with a hysteric. Why? Because the hysteric, the over-emotional drama queen, sees the schizoid as stable, as strong, as consistent, as reliable, and they like that. What does the schizoid see in the hysteric? Well, an aliveness to their seeming deadness. And so they're both fooling each other and themselves about a healthy connection. And it very frequently doesn't work out very well because it isn't a relationship based on human health and growth, integration and wholeness. It's based on overlapping pathological dynamics. They reinforce each other in some way in very unstable relationships. The great tragedy of the schizoid in some ways is that they do feel, they are overwhelmed by feeling sometimes. And so they need love and they want it, but they're scared by it. So what you have very frequently is that they crave what's unavailable, and what is available they find too dangerous. So love becomes complicated. Sexuality becomes complicated. They can be sexual, but it's superficial. Where they have the possibility of actual love, they tend to pull back and undercut any sort of intimate sexuality. We have complicated layers of connection, all of them around withdrawal dynamics. The other, along with withdrawal, the other primary defense is intellectualization. At mature levels, schizoid dynamics can result in tremendous energy being put into intellectual gifts, intellectual development. You find a schizoid often is always up in their head. They are brilliant, technically, brilliant intellectually, brilliant in terms of their mastery of intellectual fields and theories. the problem is it seems to be detached from any emotional connection to other people in the field. Again, that spectrum that I talked about right at the beginning, one can find people absolutely detached or seemingly absolutely detached. And on the other hand, you can find folks who are really creative geniuses. And I think for most therapists, the goal of good therapy with a schizoid is to move, is to sublimate that potential, that genius, that intellect into something creative and useful and adaptive in whatever milieu the patient is in. Slowly trying to tie that intellectual dynamic, which can be really productive and creative, into a more adaptive and emotionally connected experience. It starts with the therapy and hopefully moves outside. Probably the biggest danger with schizoid types in therapy is that it becomes a bit of a cocoon. The therapeutic relationship can be transformed, not very usefully in reality, into a little cocoon, into a place where it's safe. If the therapy doesn't result in a platform for the schizoid person to go out and get a little bit more emotionally connected. If the therapy itself isn't the bedrock of emotional connection that the schizoid patient can feel as safe and perhaps expand their ability to be emotionally connected even a little bit. If it ends up resulting in okay, this is a little island of safety, but does not have a direct impact on their ability to connect with others in the outside world, then in fact the therapy has become just another place that the patient can withdraw from or withdraw into, and the isolation and withdrawal tendencies tend to be reinforced. That's one of the bigger problems with this kind of population. And it's very seductive because the schizoid person is in some ways like a scared kitten, and most therapists want to feel care and concern. With a psychopath, you feel afraid. With a narcissist, you're annoyed. But with a schizoid person, you really it feels like you're drawn into a dynamic that can be quite loving, but you've got to be careful because it's easily warped. And people out in the world, they can pretend they have relationships. This is an as-if relationship most of the time. Two schizoid people can hook up with each other, and they pretend they're in a relationship. They pretend they have emotional connection. They go through the motions of it. They try to get into a relationship. They walk around as if they're connected. They can hold hands. The question is, what's on the unconscious inside of the person's experience of self? Is the meaning of that connection some intimate emotional connection? Or are they simply intellectualizing? Are they simply withdrawn emotionally and going through the socially acceptable motions? I suspect most people can feel the difference if they're at all attuned to this. All right. Let's move to chapter 10, the paranoid personality. Now these are very, very different, and the emotional dynamic is very different. Paranoid people, suspicious, humorless, a certain grandiosity, even megalomaniac sense of themselves. And I've never heard a better description of a paranoid dynamic than this. The essence of paranoid personality organization is the habit of dealing with one's felt negative qualities by projecting them. The disowned attributes then feel like external threats. Okay, the intrinsic paranoid dynamic is to experience what's bad and what's on the inside as if it were on the outside. Everyone sort of has seen in movies or film or television someone who acts paranoid. They're almost comedic at some level. The movie Dr. Strangelove is the old classic from the 60s, and there's a paranoid character in it, and he's just outrageous. It's just hilarious to watch this paranoid person with all these conspiracy theories. I mean, I think today we hear that quite frequently, conspiracy theorists. And we almost smile because they seem ridiculous at some level, but underneath, if there is a paranoid dynamic, then it's not funny. It's not funny at all. Because if you understand that the fundamental unconscious defensive dynamic is projection, if you understand that what the person is projecting are the worst elements of themselves, the worst elements of their childhoods taken in, the bad objects, the sense of themselves as bad, guilty, unlovable, shamed, that is painful to sit with. That generates an anxiety of self-experience that's got to be gotten rid of somehow. To the paranoid person, to the person sort of channeled into that way of experiencing anxiety and that method of dealing with it, projection into the outside world is better than feeling it internally. Now, it absolutely doesn't work. It doesn't have a reality base to it. The projection of the badness and then experiencing that badness as coming back to you is maladaptive. It's not reality-based. Is there bad out in the world? Yes, but to the paranoid, you're not actually looking at the bad things in the world. You are looking at a projected version of an interior experience. Now, that can generate bad things in the world. The old joke, even if you're paranoid, that doesn't mean you don't have enemies. Paranoid people can generate enemies. They act on these fantasies, and they will sometimes put individuals into that category. And this is where this dynamic is much more common than people think. People who are obsessed by conspiracy theorists, people who are overtly paranoid about the government or about communism or about fascism or about survivalists. These things have extreme examples that we sort of focus on. But the truth is, this is much more common than we think. We all have bad things in us. No human comes to adulthood without the accumulation of a great deal of pain and suffering and frustration and anger and fear and anxiety. And we can take that and put it on people in our world. We can put that on our partners very easily. Projective identification. Several years ago, I came home kind of angry at my wife. And I came through the door. I'd worked up a bit of a head of steam about it, and I had come to think that I wasn't being appreciated, and I took all those bad feelings and I put them on her, and I pointed my finger at her, and I accused her of not appreciating me, and she was doing this and that I didn't think was good, and she stopped and looked at me and let me get wound up a little bit, and then she just said, "Okay, I'm calling it projective identification," she said to me, and she's a very good psychologist herself. And I felt all of a sudden an awareness that I had done exactly this. I had felt bad about perhaps what I hadn't done well, what I was guilty of. And I put that on her and accused her of the very things I was probably more guilty of than she was, by quite a bit, I think. And I got it. And then I looked around to my patients and to other people in the world and to some of my students, and I could see that we do this all the time. The very thing that we are most guilty of, we often accuse others of. And we don't have to go to the extreme semi-humorous examples. This stuff, and frequently we look to the extreme examples because looking a little closer to home makes us a little nervous sometimes. I think paranoid dynamics are dramatically more common than the research suggests. I think if you look around your world, if you see and can have some honesty about how you sometimes treat those around you, you're going to see some paranoid, some projective dynamics almost inevitably. At the more extreme version, I think paranoid dynamics underlie almost all fanatics. Fanatics about anything inevitably have something about themselves that their fanaticism is designed to get rid of. I don't care whether you're a fanatic vegetarian or you're a fanatic vegan, if you're a fanatic environmentalist, if you're suicide bomber, a Muslim extremist. These are people who, by and large, are trying to evacuate shamed, humiliated, bad parts of themselves. And they see enemies everywhere. There's an argument, and I've heard this recently, that anyone who self-professes as an activist in any field is going to have an unhealthy streak of paranoia. The idea of it, now this is interesting because, I mean, we have the founding fathers in America. Were they paranoid and fanatics, or were the British really out to get them? This is where it gets a little complicated. I think I can say that in at least the clinical examples that I work with, when I have a patient who feels this sort of fanaticism about anything, I quickly look to the underlying projective and potentially paranoid dynamics of what they're bringing in the room, because it's amazingly consistent. The advice here is to look around and look within and ask yourself about those things you feel most intensely. Is there something in there that isn't quite reality related? Is it something in there that's a defense against your own experience of persecution, of shame, of humiliation, which we have all experienced to one degree or another? Are you in fact projecting it out on some enemy, some bad guy? And I think in our culture now, this is done to such an extreme, we've almost lost track of its universal nature. There is no political election that we can have now where both parties aren't, in a direct paranoid way, characterizing the other as the evil enemy. We have, it appears, it's been decades since we've had rational discussion of policy differences and the effects and the principled basis for different policy options. We have one policy, the bad guys have another policy, and all we do is show how evil they are, and we claim to be all that is good. There is, in paranoid dynamics, a clear splitting dynamic. All good on one side, all bad on the other. When politics degenerate to that, we find a culture immersed in paranoid dynamics. That requires us to look inside ourselves. If you hear someone, if you are in a dialogue with someone, if you catch yourself in this kind of extremist position, you must stop, take a breath, and look inside and see if you are in fact evacuating, projecting bad things about yourself onto the enemy. Are they really? Are they really that evil? Are they really that bad? Do their policies, will their policies really result in, grandmas and grandpas starving, or children being thrown out into the street, or the collapse of Western civilization? Probably not. So I think at the extreme examples, which everyone likes to focus on because they're funny and sort of ridiculous, I think in fact the focus on those extreme examples is in some way defensive, in some way avoids us from seeing how ubiquitous these things are and how personal they are. I do think that the paranoid types are a little more dangerous than the narcissistic ones. Narcissistic dynamics, if you contravene them directly, if you challenge them directly, they tend just to go away. A paranoid will fight. A paranoid will counterattack, sometimes literally, sometimes legally. Dr. McWilliams points out what she calls, I think, the notorious litigiousness, the tendency toward lawsuits that paranoid people have, and I think she's right about that. I think she's right about that, dramatically so. She also points out, and I think this has been true for 100 years, there is an interesting, and I don't know where to go with this, and I don't think there's anything definitive, but there has been an odd and interesting connection between paranoid dynamics and homosexuality. There's been a connection there that goes back a long way, that paranoid people seem to have some unconscious homoerotic dynamics going on. It's gotten to the point where there's now artistic representations of this. There was a movie several years back called American Beauty, and it had a character in it who was paranoid as he could be, and he was mostly paranoid about homosexuals. He hated homosexuals. and was violent and horrid and a hideous character for exactly that reason. And in the end, it was revealed he was homosexual and he committed suicide in the film. And what I think that reflects is an artistic representation of the projection of self-hatred. It doesn't matter, and this goes beyond simply gender identity or sexual orientation, projective processes generally. But I want to focus for a moment on homophobia. I mean, everybody's aware of it today. It's a politically very hot topic. And I think this actually explains a great deal. And in some ways, there's an irony about this. If Freud was right that sexuality is a spectrum from a type of almost pure form heterosexuality to the other end of the spectrum, a pure form, if that's possible, homosexuality, then it may be that the folks who are the most virulently homophobic are the ones who themselves have a great deal of homoerotic dynamics in them, which they unconsciously hate and attempt to project out onto who? Homosexuals. So that you could argue that it is the homophobics who themselves have so much of that homosexual tendency in them that they're, ironically, you could accuse a homophobic of being the very thing he is most viciously attacking. And I find some delicious irony in that, actually. I don't know that you'd want to actually engage in that argument with someone that disturbed, but it seems to me to, at the very least, bring down the level of anger, rage, and anxiety about a dynamic that can now perhaps be understood and evoke some curiosity as opposed to a hostile counterattack, which is, I think, all that happens now. Difficult though I think that may be. And again, a little bit like the narcissist, a paranoid, someone who is actively paranoid, who actually engages in this sort of almost obsessive conspiracy theorist dynamic, you've got to recognize at the extreme ends of the spectrum, you find someone who is chronically attempting to ward off his own humiliation. You project that internal experience of badness outside and find it out there. But what that means is their sense of identity, their sense of self is constantly embattled. They have no humor. They're constantly feeling oppressed, attacked, exploited, abused. And they counterattack with grand theories sometimes, and sometimes litigious behavior. These, a little like narcissists and sometimes sociopathic dynamics, these are very difficult people to get into therapy. You can very easily be categorized with the bad people who are trying to exploit you. If you confront a paranoid person about the content of their delusion directly, then you almost automatically evoke in that paranoid person tremendous hostility. You become part of the conspiracy theory. You become part of the badness they're trying to defend against. It takes tremendous ego strength on the part of the therapist to endure the kind of attacks that are very common with paranoid dynamics in therapy. How does this happen in the paranoid? The relational pattern in paranoid psychology. Not surprisingly, these people have been subjected to severe insults to their sense of efficacy, to their sense of power, to their identity as children. They're often overpowered, humiliated. The idea of the scapegoated child, this child who in one family has all the bad projected into them, subject to criticism, ridicule, often capricious, inconsistent punishments, often in the presence of adults who, no matter what they do, the adults can't be pleased. Adults who react to the child with utter mortification. Adults who show the children an example of paranoia, who see the world. This is another one of those rare examples where a paranoid parent can instill a paranoid dynamic in the child. But let's be clear, there's an additional level of sophistication here that McWilliams points out, that a mother or father who themselves experiences their own unmanageable anxiety, if there is unmanageable anxiety in the primary caregiver, whoever that is, the child learns that their own feelings are dangerous, that their own needs to become themselves dangerous. So they become hyper self-critical of themselves. They take in their own badness. They're taught to believe that their intense feeling states have to be gotten rid of somehow. You have this tragic, horrible combination of almost this bottomless need in the child, combined with a milieu filled with teasing and sarcasm. I have a sense that the modern grade school and junior high school obsessive, compulsive response to bullying, which seems on its own to be a problem, but I have a sense that to the extent bullying is going on, who are these bullies? Why do they bully? What's going on inside them? How about if we understand the dynamic instead of just trying to punish the overt behaviors or re-educate the bullies? This isn't about the fact that the bullies don't know what to do and what not to do or how to relate to each other. They don't need to watch more Sesame Street and have more conversations with Big Bird. Bullies won't respond to that. It's not about cognitive functioning. It's about a sense of their own dynamic. And I suspect, and there's some literature that will support this, that the bully is the future paranoid, that they can get away with punishing others, with imposing their will on others, because in childhood circumstances they have the power to do that sometimes. But my sense is that if that isn't understood at its level of genesis, if it isn't understood as a function of childhood dynamics that are around questions of defense against interior experiences of anxiety, then we're not helping the victims or the bullies change their behavior or their status. I think these bullies have been subjected to experience where their understanding of reality and their emotional reactions have been denied. They have a sense of fear inside them and shame rather than being understood, and they take what is effect, the denial of their feelings, into themselves. That is utterly intolerable, and so they project that badness out onto others. McWilliams describes the frightening, boundary-transgressing father and the absence of any soothing presence in a mother or otherwise. You put those two together, you get a person who is likely to lash out proactively instead of waiting for the inevitable abuse or mistreatment that they've come to recognize as the way they're treated. The good news is they're farther along on the McWilliams axes. That means they're more object related. They're still connected to other people. And so the acting out that they do along with the projection still has the potential, the capacity for love in there somewhere. They're more connected at an emotional level. At least the potential is there for actual emotional connection. They haven't been catastrophically abandoned in their own childhoods. However, they've been derailed in their development enough that their sense of self, and we're talking about the paranoid self now, is this horrible combination of an impotent, humiliated, and despised self. They have a terror of abuse. They have contempt for themselves and for those around them. And they end up acting out, projecting that feeling out, and then acting out in a way that appears omnipotent, a vindicated, triumphant self. When a paranoid person finds evidence that they were right, there is an aha moment. See, I knew it. And when you hear that kind of vindication of the paranoid projection, it's clear, it's manifest. I had a paranoid patient who was at times quite psychotic, and when I fairly gently, I thought, contradicted the content of her delusion, she turned on me with the paranoid stare, this intense, hate-filled look, and said to me with this snarling, "You're just like they are." And it was a little frightening, the intensity of the hate, right? That omnipotent, that vindication, that triumph. Aha, she found me out. I really was like all those persecutory people she's been fighting so valiantly for so long. I was a member of the conspiracy for about 30 seconds, and then I wasn't again. And then she pulled that back a little bit, and I could contain some of that dynamic. But very painful and very difficult for the therapist to tolerate. Very difficult, and here's the understanding. I think in the moment I had, fortunately, the ability to recognize that she wasn't attacking me, that she was attacking herself, parts of herself, the bad parts of herself that were projected into me. And it really wasn't about me, because I'm really not that vicious most of the time. So the idea was you can recognize in these people this chronic, intense fear. They are walking around in a state of anxious dread. And it's a horrible thing. And I think that's the route to understanding. That's the route to empathy with this kind of person. You don't contradict them. You don't try to argue them out of their paranoia. You just recognize that it's a terrible, painful, miserable position to be in. And you provide them with a place where their ideas aren't going to be aggressively challenged or disputed. You're just going to take them in and sort of try to give some meaning to what's going on in a way that's non-judgmental. If you can do that, a paranoid person might, because they are at least to some degree object related, still to some degree have a potential and a need for love and care and human connectedness, they might be able to take in that loving object in a way that counteracts some of their hateful objects which they've been subjected to and taken in their childhoods. Yeah, that does make the countertransference response of the therapist problematic. You can respond easily with a misperception of being attacked. If the therapist isn't strong enough themselves, then they will frequently either reject the projection or counterattack, and it becomes quite ugly quite quickly. Very few people, therapists included, I think, like being attacked. And it really takes a strong person to recognize that it's not personal, especially when it most particularly looks and sounds awfully personal indeed. So we have to be unflustered by hostility. How many of us are unflustered by hostility, especially hostility seemingly at least directed at ourselves? That's heroic work. If you can work with paranoid people, it's a daunting challenge and quite difficult, but there we are. All right, let's turn to chapter 11, Depressive and Manic Personalities. This is the longest chapter in the book, and I think rightly so, because I think it reflects a dynamic that everybody is likely to have an element of in them. This is the most common. I think for therapists, depressive dynamics are the most commonly seen dynamics in therapy. Virtually every patient coming in has some level of depressive functioning. Right now, in the Diagnostic and Statistical Manual, we have mood disorders, and there are a variety of them, and the nosology, the method of categorizing, is really quite confusing. And one of the confusing things is that they seem to keep changing the name of some of these things. And the biggest example of this is what's currently understood to be bipolar disorder. I think it was 15 years ago now, maybe a little longer. Bipolar disorder didn't exist as a category. It's the name that I believe, third edition of the Diagnostic Manual, the writers, editors of the third edition gave to what has, since 1917 or before, Freud called manic depressive disorder. They changed the name. Why? Well, it turns out it was a shift in the metapsychology we had up until DSM-3. Most psychiatry in America through the 50s and starting through the early 60s was dominated primarily by psychoanalytic thought. As cognitive behaviorism seemed to become more and more dominant and ultimately completely took over the diagnostic manual and its writings, virtually everyone now writing for the DSM is almost purely a cognitive behaviorist theorist. In fact, one of the editors of the DSM, I might have mentioned this earlier, said he would be the lead editor only if he could purge the DSM of what few items of psychoanalytic theory remained. And one of the big categories that was central to therapy and psychopathology was depression. A major subset of that was the category of manic depressive disorder. And all they really did, frankly, was change the name because they didn't like Freud and they didn't like psychoanalytic theory. So they took the exact manic depressive dynamic and called it bipolar, as if it was something new. And really, if you look at what it used to be diagnosed as, the elements of the diagnosis, with the current one, it's effectively identical. But not quite. And the problem is bipolar disorder sounds like it's bipolar. It sounds like there's two poles. And in physics, that means they're equal, north and south, okay? In a magnetic spectrum are the same, actually, just opposite poles. Not one isn't better than the other, one doesn't cause the other. And so manic dynamics and depressive dynamics are seen as a bipolar thing now. And the truth is they're not, never have been. Depression is the core dynamic in bipolar disorder. The manic part is a reaction to a major depressive dynamic that the mind of the suffering person responds to the depression with a manic acting out, a manic acting in sometimes, feeling states generated that are the opposite of the hideously painful depressive dynamic. So it isn't equal bipolar dynamics, it's a depressive dynamic that's quite serious, quite profound, and a reaction to it that is generating an experience that is the opposite. But it isn't real. It's a defense against the depression. It is in fact part of the depressive dynamic. So there's some language problems here that makes this part of understanding psychopathology much more complicated than it should be, and that's just the way it is, and so I'll try to clarify it as best I can. Okay, so let's talk about depression first. The key characteristics of any depressive dynamic: unremitting sadness, a lack of energy, a lack of enjoyment in everyday activities, disturbances in sleep, eating, and self-regulation. Those are the core symptomatic dynamics in any depressive dynamic, and it's usually a matter of degree how serious it is. I think I can say that there are very few researchers in the last almost 100 years that have done better than Freud did in 1917. He laid down the basic dynamics of depressive processes, and I don't think he's been improved on, frankly, all that much. In 1917, he wrote a book called Mourning and Melancholia, and he described mourning as a normal process, melancholia as what we now would call depression, as a pathology. What he said, and this is the brilliance of it that has to be understood today, because it remains as true today as it was in 1917. And the inability to distinguish these two things is the source of a great deal of unnecessary suffering in my field, and I think in our culture. Depression is premised upon early childhood losses that were intolerable to the child, unmanageable, uncontainable, and the anger and frustration that generated in the child had nowhere to go. And so the anger gets turned back against the self. Depression is primarily anger in childhood developmental dynamics turned back against the self. You're not angry at the mother who fails you. You're angry at yourself because you're clearly not good enough. You're the bad one. It's your fault. It's your responsibility. Children feel that way because they have to. All neglected and abused and children who do not get what they need in sufficient degrees to generate pathology are put in exactly the same impossible dilemma. They're put in a dilemma that looks like this. Either my parents are evil, my parents are horrible, I have bad parents, or it's all my fault. I'm the bad one. If I was better, this wouldn't be happening. And you must understand that there isn't a child in the world who is severely neglected or abused can accept the idea of that first option, because that would generate almost psychotic levels of anxiety. If the child realizes that that's true, if the child allows themselves to realize the truth of that, which is true all too often, then they're doomed. They're not going to survive. They're not, it's too horrible. So where do they go with that frustration, with that rage, with that anger, with that hate? They turn it back against themselves. It must be my fault. I'm the bad one. I'm the guilty one. If I was just a better boy, Daddy would come back. And so they try to be better because it's the only way they can maintain even a delusional form of hope that their misery will end, that they will change. If they're the fault, then they have some hope for being better. They have some hope for relief from their suffering. Turns out it doesn't work that way. They just continue to suffer. If fundamentally you take in the sense of your own badness, then you continue to act as if you're bad and continue to do things and get in relationships where that unconscious experience of your own guilt gets acted out in ways that continue to bring punishment to you. It's sad beyond endurance, quite frankly. People in major depressive disorders have a statistically significant increase in suicides. This can be a black hole out of which we do not crawl without sufficient help. But I also want to go back to that dichotomy between mourning and melancholia. It appears that we have confused these two. Grieving, sadness at a real loss, is normal. We will grieve a loss. If your dog dies, you are supposed to feel sad. It's not pathology, it's life. You got to deal with it. You got to actually feel the loss of something that's a real meaningful loss in the real world. And when you're a child, if you have a loss, if a parent dies, if a parent goes away, if a pet dies, if something else bad happens, and the child can be helped to acknowledge that as a loss, and their experiences of mourning can be validated and managed, and they get some help working through it, then they don't get depressed. People who mourn actually, in reality, almost never get depressed. The problem, of course, is childhood development. And this is the hard part for a lot of people, that childhood development from birth on, perhaps even starting at birth, is in some ways inevitably a series of potentially traumatic losses. A child is weaned from the breast. To the child, that is a traumatic loss. A child is born. The loss of the inner experience of peace and containment in the womb is lost in a very painful, direct way. The loss of a symbiotic oneness with the mother is developmentally necessary. You must develop a sense of your own autonomy, but it is a loss to the child that must be acknowledged as a loss. If it isn't, the child takes that in as something wrong with them. And so, to assist in all phases of childhood development, parents must recognize and acknowledge the reality of the child's loss along with their gains. It's really two sides of the same coin. Development and growth and enhancement and maturing have attached to it inevitably an experience, sometimes a painful experience, always perhaps, an experience of painful loss. Feel the mourning for the loss and you don't get depressed. The way Freud described it, I think, is brilliant. In mourning, in grieving that is healthy, one feels that the world is depleted. The world can be an empty place without that lovely old dog that recently passed. In depression, the self is hollowed out. The self feels empty. The self is depleted. And that's a completely different experience. If you can distinguish between those two things, if you can assist the children in mourning their legitimate losses, then depression is insulated against. Going back to the 20s, the precursor of depression is premature loss. The classic example cited is weaning. You can take a child away from the breast too soon. You can take a child away from the mother too soon. It appears now with the fragmentation of the nuclear family, we may in fact, like McWilliams said in other contexts, be generating whole generations of depressives. Babies, young children, toddlers are being taken away from their mothers, put into daycare that's inadequate for the child's developmental needs. That kind of loss is not being processed properly. That kind of loss can't be processed properly. It's too fundamental, too profound for many children, not all, but many. And it seems to me we are therapists, sadly, will never be out of work if things keep going the way they are. We are, I think, more in danger of developing a culture rife with depression than we've probably ever been, because the developmental needs of the children are not being dealt with adequately or even acknowledged. And I think that becomes painfully clear in the addictions. The argument here is that addiction relates to the oral tendencies of depression. This has been noticed by for the last 100 years. I don't think there's much dispute about this. That childhood losses in the taking in of love, which are interrupted, interfered with, when there's a loss there, reflect addictions in adolescent and adulthood. Drinking, smoking, drug addictions, gambling addiction, internet addiction, sex addiction. All these topics are now sort of discreetly the rage in my field. But there's an argument, and I think a valid one, that they all represent mere symptoms of a fundamental underlying depression when you did not get what you needed and wanted. And so now the symptom of the adolescent or the adult is to attempt to take in external things to make up for the lack inside. And of course, it can't work. It never does work. How much do you need to drink before you soothe your depression? There isn't enough alcohol in the world. And I think that dynamic, if we can recognize that, treatment for addictions will be much more successful. And we have to recognize that mourning is normal. Not every pain is pathology. I think in our culture now, we're so hyper-attuned to pain that we think every mental illness that causes pain has to be medicated, and that just isn't true. People need to learn that they're supported and contained, and that their pain is part of life that can be endured, can be overcome, might even be the source of strengthening and development. And we are doing, I think, a less and less good job at being able to distinguish pain from pathology. I think that has to be constantly kept in mind. The defenses of the depressive type focus on introjection. They take in, they pull back the anger against themselves. And very frequently, I approach a depressed patient with a question. When I hear them punishing themselves, when I hear them blaming themselves, I want to hear, whose voice is that? Who is saying that to the child? It's almost always. And the patients realize that when I ask that question, oh, that's my dad, that's my mom. I hear my mom's voice all the time in my head saying, I'm worthless, I'm useless. Okay, it might have originally been the mom's voice or the dad's voice or a fantasy. It might not have been the real parent. It could easily have been a co-created fantasy. But the patient now has that inside them, and it drives them to quite destructive behaviors. The reason this can be so difficult in therapy, and I think in the real world, is because patients whose childhoods have developed through this introjection of anger and suffering and frustration build that up Human life is the accumulation of experience, and if you've taken in and year out such anger and pointed it back at yourself and repressed it into your unconscious. I have patients, when I see depressed patients, I am careful because they frequently have a volcano of anger inside of them, and their depression is actually a shell of a defense, an introjection that has to be, the lid has to be kept on. And when we get to anger with depressed patients, it can be very difficult and sometimes very dangerous. You have to go slow and careful. You cannot just rip the lid off and say, hey, look at all that volcano down there. Look at all that repressed anger. It generates potentially psychotic anxieties in patients, and it has to be handled with great sensitivity. And it also has to be handled with great understanding, because it isn't the patient's fault. They're doing things that hurt themselves, and we want them to stop, but you have to recognize that the unconscious dynamic that generated this has meaning. And for the child, it's better to blame themselves. It's better to hurt themselves, because in some ways, as a child, that gave them power that they didn't have otherwise. Better to hurt myself than to wait around for the inevitable punishment to happen. It gives me a sense of efficacy if I can choose my own suffering. It's a terrible dilemma. It's a painful one. It shouldn't be that way, but it is all too often. And the theme going through most depressive therapies is often that underlying anger. They're angry, and they're scared of their anger. That is the dynamic that I think many clinicians run to ground on, because they themselves don't handle anger very well. Anger is difficult to manage, and there can be collusion between the therapist and the patient. Depressives are often angry, though they look often exhausted, pathetic, self-punishing, harmless. They really are sitting on volcanoes of rage that can be quite devastating. If you understand that, you can recognize the dynamics underneath some of their behavior, help them bring to consciousness slowly and carefully those dynamics, and the depression can be lifted that way, and only that way, it seems to me.